Hi, Ellie Shovel is here. There's something I've been wanting to talk about on a video for a while. It's a painful topic, but it's very, very relevant to so many of the couples that we as couples therapists see in our offices. And it's very current. Like, it's something that I think comes up differently in our times than it did maybe a generation ago or even more recently than that. And that's the topic of how do we define an infidelity incident in a relationship? Because there are just a lot of different, what I call subjective measures of fidelity. Not everyone experiences, I guess for lack of a better word, we'll say cheating, acting outside of the relationship in the same way. There are different behaviors. There's some behaviors that everyone would agree. A very obvious form of infidelity would be an actual physical sexual relationship with an emotional attachment that involves sexual intercourse. I don't think anybody would say that that's not an infidelity episode. The only way that you wouldn't call it an infidelity episode is if the marriage were predefined as an open marriage, meaning there are some people who get married with the understanding, or they go into a relationship with the understanding that it's an open relationship, so that it is considered okay for the both parties to have other sexual or even emotional and sexual relationships with other people. That's an open relationship. But for the majority of relationships that are monogamous, that would be considered a betrayal. And I think it's important to understand and to know with your partner what your terms of loyalty and betrayal are within your relationship. Because fidelity and infidelity are not always like very clear-cut binary. There are like a lot of shades of gray in between. So there are like three standards that I sometimes think about. There's the marital piece, the integrity of the relationship. There's the emotional piece, like how it feels to each spouse. And then there's the socio-cultural standards, like the religious piece, because sometimes there are behaviors that, depending on where you're coming from and what your values and frames of reference are, would be either considered or not considered acting, against the integrity of the marriage. And all of this stuff is embedded in the context of what the relationship is, how it's set up, and how people understand what fidelity looks like within a relationship. So, for example, let's say another example of something that would be considered, let's say, an affair would be sleeping with a prostitute, or getting drunk and having sex with a stranger. That would also be considered an infidelity episode sexually. It doesn't have the emotional attachment component of the example that we said before, where there's like a full-blown relationship as opposed to like a one-time encounter, but it definitely has the aspect of intercourse, so that would be something that people would consider an affair. On the other side, the flip side, like conversely, if someone would become deeply, secretively, emotionally intimate with someone else that's, of the opposite sex, it's talking about a heterosexual relationship, they would develop an emotionally intimate relationship with someone that's not their spouse, that could be an example of what's called an emotional affair without the sexual component. When you're dealing with same-sex couples, it's much trickier, because something that would be called a friendship is much harder to define when there's no physical, manifestation of intimacy involved. Likewise, if someone's cheating on their heterosexual relationship by having a sexual relationship or an emotionally intimate relationship with a same-sex friend or partner, these lines sometimes become blurred. Again, unless there's sexual activity, in which case then I think most people would agree that would be considered an infidelity episode. There are some behaviors that some spouses might see as disloyal and others wouldn't. So some of the very common ones that people struggle with are the topic of pornography, and cyber sexual activity, phone sex and sexting with a specific other partner. I think most people would recognize as being of some sort of a betrayal of the relationship, again, unless there's an understanding that we're all okay with this. But certainly, viewing pornography, in some cultures, even masturbation, in some cultures, even viewing non-pornographic videos or pictures for pleasure, especially for the purpose of getting aroused, would definitely feel like a betrayal. There's also an element of secrecy involved, so if somebody's doing this like in full view of their partner, and there's this feeling of like, oh, you can do this, I can do this, we can do this together, that's very different than if it's happening like behind their back in a way that's clearly meant to sort of like be hidden, so that, because I know you don't like this and I know you wouldn't approve of this. So, that's also has to do with the context within the relationship and also the values. Other subjective measures of fidelity include like mild flirtation. Sometimes couples will fight over whether an interaction between one spouse and a person that's not in the marriage would be considered flirtatious or not. deep exclusive connection with an extramarital partner, visiting places that have sexual overtones and activities like bars, certain kinds of bars or events that have like very scantily clad or topless servers, massage parlors, especially where there's the option of a happy ending, strip clubs, or engaging in physical affection that's not intercourse. So if you remember way back, former President Clinton was, they were commenting about him like, okay, so we might actually have to analyze here whether giving somebody oral sex that's not your spouse constitutes, an affair. And I think like the people, sarcastically said, well, it's not fidelity, so there are, and obviously that is sexual activity, but even something like, any kind of affectionate petting, touching, kissing, where do we draw that line? And there are other issues that people sometimes get busy with outside of the marriage that could feel like a betrayal of the relationship. People become, let's say, workaholic. They get very busy with work, with the gym, with their family of origin, with certain friendships, religious commitments, support groups, 12-step programs, travel, like all of that stuff. There's definitely marriages that suffer because one party has found something that they're more excited about or more passionate about or spending more time and energy on than their relationship. And feeling abandoned or neglected by your partner because they seem to care more about something else than they do about you or your marriage, or that they're more excited or passionate about it, that's really hard. And it can definitely feel like a betrayal of love. It is outside of the scope of what we're talking about here because it's different from actually seeing your partner be sexually or intimately involved with another specific person. But that definitely still deserves a conversation within your relationship because relationships do need active maintenance in order to stay, to be strong and to be maintained and to feel connected. So whenever we're looking at any kind of stressor on the relationship, particularly when it involves stuff having to do with fidelity and attachment, or any symptom of anything, actually, we look at FID, frequency, intensity, duration. How often, how many times did this happen? Is this a pattern? Is this like a one-time indiscretion? Was it premeditated or impulsive? So that's the frequency issue. The second thing we look at is intensity, like how much went on, what exactly was the episode, what did it entail, how deeply involved were the people, and duration, how long did it last? Because depending on those sort of three metrics, we can assess and analyze the degree of the trauma to the relationship and how we're going to address it in the healing process. So I just felt like it was important to note that, issues like, again, if there's like a full-on sexual encounter where there's, intercourse or something that approximates, sexual activity in a very obvious way, I think people would be hard-pressed to say that that's not a betrayal. Although again, certain kinds of dancing are, gray area depending on, what is, considered culturally appropriate versus like subjective or promiscuous or suggestive within your culture. Then there are the opposite extreme. I remember I used to live in a neighborhood that was Haredi Israeli, very, very religious. So there were men who lived on the same level of my apartment building that if I would walk outside, they don't say good morning to a woman that's not their wife. That's considered a breach of the boundary of their relationship. So that's not my culture, but that was their culture. And so that's something that they had to, preserve based on their understanding of fidelity. Most people would consider that extreme, but these are, when we're looking from one extreme to the next, really figuring out within your relationship what your expectations are, what you think, what you expect of your spouse, what they expect of you, what that secrecy is always sort of a red flag. If you're doing something or your partner's doing something that has to be kept a secret, chances are there's something going on there that could be, a little bit of a threat to the integrity of the relationship. And then if you're trying to heal from an infidelity episode, recognize that these are way more common than a lot of people realize. And very often it is possible to heal, but it does take work. It's not something that you just get over and say, okay, well, you're just going to have to learn to trust me again, or I'm just going to have to get over it. In order to integrate and really heal, the feelings need to be processed. Okay, thanks for listening.